Today on Panelism, we're taking a trip back into Grant Morrison's Multiversity.
Welcome to Panelism, the podcast where we talk about the comics and graphic novels worth having on your shelf. I'm Todd A.
I'm Taylor Trask.
Good day, sir.
Good day to you. How are things in sunny Southern California?
Well, it's not sunny. We've got the June gloom going on right now, so it's been a little overcast all day. I'll tell you what, it has barely been over 70 any day for the last month and a half. And when I hear that summer has already come to the East Coast and the South, I'm so thankful.
Yeah.
Because it's just been so pleasant to go outside in jeans. You know?
Same here. It has been unusually cool in May. We had some late snow, like the latest snow Colorado's had in a long time. And then it had been sort of unseasonably cool. And now June feels more like May would. And it's just fantastic. Yeah. I'm like, this is like living in the Pacific Northwest. I love it.
God, it's already in the 90s in Nashville.
I don't even want to think about that. I left there for that exact reason, so I didn't have to think about it or be confronted with it anymore.
Yes. I am so excited about the show today that once again, I can barely chit-chat with you because I'm champing at the bit to talk about it. It's
going to be jam-packed. We're doing something a little unusual. In episode, I believe, 57 or 58. I forget which.
I will confirm that.
Well, back when we used to do dual book reviews, Todd would do a book, I would do a book. The episodes were a little long, so we decided to make each episode more single book focused. And I think that's proven to be a great model or formula for how we do the show. Back in the day, we did two books. And I think Todd did Grey Hulk, and I did a book called The Multiversity, written and sort of conceived by Grant Morrison and the art by a large cast of creative people that we'll potentially talk about. So I've talked about this book already, and recently it's become clear to me that I need to revisit it, both as a fan and a reader, but also on this show. I think in that particular episode, I touched on some interesting points and did largely a more top-level review because I think at that point, too, we were more concerned with readers who hadn't read the books yet. And I want to really delve in a little further and talk about a lot more. There's a lot more I've picked up since my last read through it, and really treat this as a discussion episode for people who are familiar with the book or who haven't read it but don't care and maybe want to use this as an extended sales pitch. So that's fine too. But I think we're just going to title this Multiversity Revisited. Yeah. For that purpose.
Well, I'm excited about it because in the old 2 books per episode format, we sometimes had read the same book, but rarely had we both prepared for what the other one was doing. And now when we often tape 2 episodes on the same day, while we may know what the other one is talking about and have done some sort of, surface level research on it, often we don't know that much. But I have not read the full Multiversity, but I had read a couple of issues when it came out. You talked about it. And then when you told me you were doing this book, I checked on Comixology Unlimited, and they have this amazing omnibus that is like the box set DVD kind of, extended editions with so many extras and stuff. And so you gave me an assignment of issues to read from this omnibus, and I did that. So I feel like I'm going in pretty well prepared, which is a great feeling.
Now, when you say omnibus, you mean the Multiversity, the deluxe edition, correct?
I believe so. They called it an omnibus on Comixology, and I assume that's because it's not really like a trade paperback or whatever they call those. Collected editions is usually what they call those things. And this one's like got so many extras. I guess this is literally everything they put out for the series, so it's not. Yeah, it's not a collected edition like volume 1. It's everything.
Correct. And I had previously when I talked about it, I own that version as the physical hardcover book. So that is definitely the one you want to get, because it just, you want the whole sort of vision in one sitting. I had the physical version. One of the reasons that we're revisiting this book is because I recently consumed it totally via Comixology. I don't know if this is still going on. If you're listening, this may have passed, but last week, Comixology did have the digital version for just $5. I don't know why. Now it looks like it's back up to 20 for the Kindle price. So keep an eye on it. But I grabbed it for $5, which is great because I did already own the hardcover, and it allowed me to go through it again. I was on a little road trip vacation and started going through some key issues that I liked, but ended up rereading the entire thing because the guided page view in Comixology really lends itself nicely to this story. There were a lot of things that I didn't notice the first time around. Most importantly, the character voices really jumped out at me this time around. I heard specific voices for different characters very, very deliberately where I didn't before. So that was a really cool thing to see. So I frankly don't remember what my recommendation was last time. We usually speak about or recommend either physical or digital. I would say both are very valid ways to consume this book. And I would encourage people to do both, because there is, as you're going to hear, there's a lot more subtext and a lot more context you're going to get out of this a second, third, fourth time through. So mix up the way you consume it. It will, I think, maybe lend itself more to that.
Well, that's good to hear, especially with this new perspective of me having read particular issues that you assigned, because it definitely doesn't, the digital format does not lend itself to jumping to a particular issue. But I wholeheartily agree with you on the guided view, and had a very similar experience, so I guess I gotta back you up there. It's like, if you love it, then it might be worth owning in both formats, because you can sort of enjoy the story front to back in digital with that guided view, like cinematic approach, or you can just sort of pick and choose throughout the book, like what you want. But it is dense and it is long. So sitting down to read it for the first time fully all the way through digitally might not be optimal.
And just some background on the book, in case you're not aware. This was originally I think 7 or 8 individual issues. I believe it was 8 that came out over the course of a period of time. They're all part of this Multiversity series. All of them except for one is a issue 1 of an Elseworlds kind of series. So you've got different versions of Superman, or the origins of Superman, or different versions of Dr. Fate, and these are all issue 1s. The only one that isn't is the ending issue, which bookends the first issue, which kind of sets up the master narrative, or the master arc, and introduces the concept of the multiversity. It has a start and an ending. And Morrison has mentioned he may go back to some of these and do a continuation on them. The Minutemen, or not Minutemen, the Mastermen one, I think is top of his mind to do that. The one where the Nazis raised Superman. He's thinking about going back to that one too. So Grant Morrison, writer, showrunner, various artists, published by DC. I want to state up front, we are going to spoil the hell out of this. So if you haven't read it and this is concerning to you, maybe go back and listen to episode 57 or 58. 57, thank you. Episode 57, where I first talk about this book. But we're going to treat this more like reviewing an episode of a TV show we've all seen, or like this is our book club, and everybody has read this. If you haven't, go read it. Let's discuss it. I'm going to get into the weeds pretty deep on a lot of interesting points.
Yeah, unlike our other episodes that are, like a review to give you a recommendation of something interesting to put on your shelf. This is one where you've got some issues, not in a negative sense. You shared with me a thick, veiny document full of stuff.
Yeah.
It is
So let's talk about why. I mean, I've mentioned a few reasons why why you should revisit this particular book. I think the best comics, the best graphic novels deserve a revisit. They oftentimes can change over time. Different contexts in the world we're living in can shape how you see a story. Your own growth as a person can shape how you see or perceive a story. The artists who make that art, their lives and their changes and ebbs and flows or controversies about them that might pop out and change your perception of that art. So it's definitely worth going back and rereading some of these things. Couple similar books that jump out to me on that are The Inkle, which by design is meant to be so deep and layered that you can just always get something from it. Obviously, my go-to of Watchmen. I think the recent Vision series that ended, the Tom King series, and then Dark Knight Returns, probably. Nightly News by Jonathan Hickman, which I've reviewed previously, that definitely warrants multiple readings. You get more every time you pop your head in that. And so I think the Multiversity was surprising to me in that respect, because I read it first and loved it, but didn't anticipate it sort of becoming one of these books that I can just keep going back to and getting new context out of, new interesting points of view out of. I think when I first read it and reviewed it previously, I had fallen in love with the story and the ambitious scope. And now I think when I read it, I'm still aware of those things, but I'm now falling in love with the deep rabbit hole of the true art behind it, all the subtext, all the stuff that Morrison put into it as pure artistic expression. I'm seeing it so much more clearly now than I did before, and it's really driving my love of this series.
Now, obviously, we're going to jump into that, but what's your quick overview on what you mean by the true art of it?
So, like, the more you know about Grant Morrison, it really does color how you look at any of his works.
Do you think this was in that way? Do you think this is sort of his own expression on superhero comics and the importance or non-importance of comics and things like that? Is that
God, yes.
sort of how you're coming at it? Okay.
Yeah, it's all of that. I mean, it's so many different things, right? So so on one hand, you've got his involvement in the DC multiverse timeline, going all the way back to his work with Mark Waid on the Kingdom and how they introduced hyper time. He's also the one that was involved in sort of shepherding Infinite Crises and other Elseworlds titles to their conclusion. So he's got a vested interest in how the multiverse is set up, how the New 52 is set up, what its ambitions were going to be. So you've got that, and in a lot of titles, that's all you need, right? It's just, hey, I'm sort of the architect of this, or I've had a heavy hand in this. I want to express my version of that story. So you've got that. You've also got, to your point, how he views superheroes, and that's a very multifaceted view. What he thinks about the importance of comic books and the grand cultural narrative, how he views comic books as an expression of free thinking and free expression, and how you interpret that both as reader and creator. So you've got that. Then you've got this other crazy element of Grant Morrison, the Chaos Magician. So,
well, I know I don't want to divert you because I love these topics you've outlined. I'm wondering if there's a tiny like elevator pitch we could do on what this book actually is.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just gonna read straight out of Wikipedia.
That works.
I'll just read because it's so complex and multifaceted that I don't want to get too rambly. So
yeah, I don't know that I have an elevator pitch for it.
Straight up, Wikipedia just says the Multiversity is a limited series of interrelated one-shots set in the DC multiverse in the New 52. All right, so that's just straight up one log line. That's what we're dealing with. What it really is I'm just going to again read from Wikipedia. The featured story arc is about the DC Comics multiverse being invaded by a race of cosmic parasites known as the Gentry. Then it says the Gentry come from beyond the immediate DC local multiverse, and each member is a sort of a cultural archetype. We'll talk more about that later. So you've got this master arc of the DC universe multiverse being invaded, and then a group of heroes gather to try to solve that master sort of overarching narrative problem. Meanwhile, each of these one-shots represents a slice of that invasion. And each of these, sort of universes or different Earths can look at the events of the other Earths through their own comic books. So you've got people in one issue reading the previous issue, that you as the reader were reading. They've got that actual issue in their universe, and vice versa. And it doesn't always piggyback off directly the previous book you read. There's one issue in particular called Ultra Comics, which is referenced in most of the books. We're going to get into that later because there's
that's its own section.
There is so much packed into that I don't even want to. So we'll come back to that. But so the whole thing is a wonderful way to have a lot of fun with Elsewhere's titles, and do it all kind of in a compilation. But there's this overarching narrative. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it is.
Yeah, but
I'm going to get way more into the nitty gritty.
I think all that's missing from that pitch is that even though they are Elseworlds and there are some issues where you'll run into a Batman or a Superman, this is not done like that original like 1980s Crisis on Infinite Earths where all the Supermans look alike, but maybe one of them has some gray hair or something. This is like they're totally, they are literally a Superman from a different dimension. I'm thinking of the one that's the Barack
Obama Superman. For all intents and purposes.
Is he also the president?
Yes.
Okay.
He's not Barack Obama, but he is a black president from an Earth that is also Kal-El.
And right? Brainiac is like his personal AI assistant.
Yes, it's like his Jarvis. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So it's wild like that. So it's not like you can pick it up like, oh, here's a what if story about Batman. It's like the most extreme what if ever. Like
with like a very deliberately different costume too. Yeah. And so so many of these, or maybe Captain Marvel / Shazam is probably the only loyally recreated. You're going to recognize that pretty quickly. Yeah. But everything else and the mainstream sort of versions of these heroes, they're in it too, but they are absolutely background characters. You might get a glimpse of the real Batman or the real Superman or the real Flash, but they are literally one of, hundreds of other versions of themselves. They're kind of just in the background waving. They're not really there to serve the story, front and center.
Yeah, and for me, having recently read Crisis on Infinite Earths, we talked about that in episode 99 earlier this year. It's Crisis on this like I can see Morrison pitching this as let me rewrite Crisis, but from the point of view of all those characters you put in the background.
Yeah,
because Crisis only revolves around like the Justice League, and then these sort of
that way of thinking about
random new 2 or 3 characters that are, like they've never been in anything before. So, oh, well, you're pivotal to this.
Yeah.
And then just a bunch of background heroes,
Every character you meet is somebody that you don't really have a primary relationship with via other comics.
Yeah.
It's really cool to see these archetypes, but they are not what you expect. I mean, that was very intentional and I love it. That was what attracted me to this kind of in the first place was, I get to see these sort of bog standard tropes and characters, but through a completely different prism. In much the same way too that Watchmen dissected that and gave you sort of versions of these characters. In some ways, that's kind of interesting because Watchmen was originally going to be the Charlton Comics characters, and instead got you sort of a counterpart version of each of those, and allow them to really go even further. So this is kind of like that, although it's still mainstream continuity.
It definitely feels like Morrison's Watchmen.
Yeah.
But and I'll tell you the downside to that is when I did pick up these separate issues, which were labeled as sort of like one shots that related to a, multiversity. I thought it was typical like big event books, they're all going to tie in. And I didn't know what the fuck to make of them. So, and we talked about that, I think, in episode number 57 as well, that like this has to be approached as a whole piece, And it was such a weird packaging to actually put them out as single, like floppy single issues, because they really just did not make any sense.
It absolutely is meant to be a graphic novel, although there's some novelty in having the single issues because you do sort of get to treat them as artifacts from the book that you get to hold yourself, which is kind of cool.
It turns into, and I would say buying or like looking at single issues on Comixology, useless. But if you had those artifacts, you are like that is one of the wonderful like statements of art, which you're just now making me think of, which is like you are the viewer in one universe reading the true history of another universe through that book.
Yeah.
And because they actually put them out as separate, like single issues, you could have all of them and feel like, oh, I'm in this world now reading that world's history, you know? Yeah, it's very Griffin and Sabine kind of tactile art, you know?
Absolutely. Great reference.
I knew you would get it.
Yeah.
You know, that's you were viewing and you're reading an epistolary novel, right?
Yep. Exactly. So let's get back to Morrison real quick.
Because
it all starts with him. As truly, you know, he's one of our top creators in the field. He is as prolific and as interesting as Alan Moore, as Jodorowsky, as any of these just heavy hitter creative guys that can do something at this depth and breadth. Interestingly, like Alan Moore, Grant Morrison Alan Moore's not a chaos magician, but they're both into what they define personally as magic. And I'm sort of intrigued by this because it seems like this might be a sort of tradition in comics amongst a lot of these creators of sort of embracing these metaphysical, pseudo-spiritual sorts of practices to either enhance their own creative art or just to use it as a thought experiment in a lot of ways. So chaos magic, I need to go through this because it does impact how I view a lot of the parts of the book now. If you've ever listened to, there's a favorite podcast of Todd and I's called The Last Podcast on the Left. We are very big fans. And one of the members of that show, Henry Zabrowski, often refers to chaos magic or references it. So if you're really interested in it, listen to that show and you probably can pick up a lot. I don't want to get into it too far, but just the basic tenets of it. I'm not a practitioner, just for the record. I've studied it a bit and just kind of looked into it based on a lot of these people getting into it too. But the basic aspect of it is it's built around an experimental, highly DIY approach that involves stripping all magical techniques down to their barest essence. Getting rid of all the theatrics, getting rid of all the, the incantations and all this stuff, and just thinking about magic is almost like pure thought to manifest what you want. Use of intentionality. You know what? You're not wrong. That's the secret is a weird sort of commercialized form of chaos magic. Absolutely. Where Grant Morrison gets into it, and I'm basing this on a lot of interviews he's given over the years and that I've consumed and other things he's written. But Grant Morrison really does embrace the sort of DIY intentionality of it. And he also uses sigils and what is called cut-up technique a lot too. Cut-up technique, strangely, all this is on Wikipedia, by the way, in case you want a beginner's sort of intro to all this. Cut-up technique involves taking things, and originally it was text, cutting it up and rearranging it to create new text, but that also can be applied to any sort of remix culture. Taking things as established mediums, remixing them, rearranging them to either new inspiring effect or to an intentionally change the nature of a story or change the nature of a thing. Strangely, David Bowie was also sort of into this aspect of chaos magic. Jodorowsky, to some extent, too. The use of tarot and tarot cards is kind of in this tradition. So taking Grant Morrison, and Grant Morrison, is one of his classic stories is he summoned the spirit or the ghost or the essence of John Lennon, and actually wrote a John Lennon inspired song that sounds pretty close. And he did this by just sitting in a circle surrounded by John Lennon albums and listening to the Beatles and just thinking on and taking on the essence of John Lennon. And he claims to have seen sort of a John Lennon-like face materialize in front of him. Kind of, very wooey. But if you take him at face value, that's very interesting. And he's also famously known for using his series, The Invisibles, as an actual chaos magical act. Meaning he wrote himself into the Invisibles as a character, and things that started happening to that character in the Invisibles started happening to Grant Morrison in real life because he was so intentionally manifested into the work of the Invisibles. It's kind of spooky, and especially if you read the Invisibles, knowing this really changes your lens on it, knowing that this was intentionally set up as a chaos magic sort of experiment for himself. So knowing all of that really colors some of what I read in the Multiversity. Specifically things like the Ultra Comics issue, like the Pax Americana, is it Pax Americana or Pax Romana? Pax Americana. Sort of Charlton Watchman mashup that he does. A lot of chaos magic sort of ideas fall into this. This is not to say that this is like some kind of spooky devil worshipping cult thing. Not at all. Think of chaos magic more as like a pseudo psychology or a pseudo science to that extent. Not a religion, not some kind of weird occult thing. Just Grant Morrison thinking about the world through these lenses.
Well, and it almost makes more sense because I wasn't thinking of any of that at all when I read it, but there's definitely like a sort of the big bad guys, or at least the big threat that comes into the multiversity is demonic in nature. Yeah. And so even while like magic and demons aren't talked about in like a religious or occult way, it honestly sort of made a little bit more sense for the setting than the ordinary superhero sort of cosmos gobbledygook. Like, ooh, I mean, like Crisis on Infinite Earths is a perfect example of like, it's all just this sort of hand wavy, like, oh, the anti-monitor has just done this thing that, has imperiled everyone. Well, how? Like what? Yeah, what happened? Yeah. I'd almost rather it be like, well, these demons of chaos have erupted in between the universes and everything's colliding. And
that's a great point. So this isn't Darkseid invading. This isn't some evil presence or enemy that
Thanos.
Yeah. This is literally the sort of personification of archetypes that have plagued humanity for a long time. The incursion into the multiverse is by this group called the Gentry. And I'm just going to read you a quick sort of summation of what they are, because that kind of highlights this point very, very nicely. It says the Gentry were drawn to the multiverse by the emanations of ruined dreams and negative ideas. So they were attracted to our multiverse by those things. They want to seize ownership of every single mind in existence, and in doing so, control all thoughts and stories. To this end, they use Ultra Comics #1 as a vector to infect the multiverse, and they simultaneously launch an attack on every Earth in the orrery of worlds. It also says, and I'm going to kind of give you a sense of this, each member of the Gentry sort of exists as a different amalgamation of these bad ideas or these things. So there's one of the Gentry is called Demogorgon. He's the mindless, sprawling horde. Another character is called Hell Machine, which is meant to represent unchecked, uncontrollable technology. Dame Merciless is the ultimate extreme of the femme fatale. And then the other member, Lord Broken, is insanity and despair. So these are really sort of the archetypes of all these classic mythological ideas. That's what the big bad is of this whole thing. So it's almost more startling. It kind of sucks you in a little more, knowing that there's this completely new idea of what could plague the DC multiverse, but it also brings in the subtext of thought control, both literally in the story, but also in the comics medium in general. Going back to things like banning certain books and censoring books, and just this idea of the history of comics representing free thought and free expression, and the industry or the public or the government trying to limit that in some ways. The Gentry are kind of representing that too. So there's just all these wonderful layers that you can read into this now, knowing that Grant Morrison was interested in these ideas, but also the historical context of these ideas. Again, it goes back to the art of it. Really creeps up on you after you've gotten through it a few times. A couple other things real quick to the art. There's also, Grant Morrison has mentioned a few times, he likes the idea of the flash lightning bolt symbol, really representing a lot of things. If you think about Greek mythology or Hindu mythology, the lightning bolt, or lightning was the primary weapon of the head god. In the case of Greek mythology, it was Zeus or Indra in Hindu.
Norse as well.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I mean, and plenty of other examples. So that lightning bolt symbol has been important to Grant Morrison in a lot of different stories. In the case of this, the Flash character, regardless of what Earth or what universe he's from or she's from, tends to be the one that has either crucial information about the problem that they're solving, or actually literally helps them, deal the final blow or solve the problem. So the Flash plays a huge role throughout the multiversity. I wonder if it doesn't tie back into that idea of the lightning bolt having that importance. Another thing that's really interesting about this is the use of music and the use of musical harmonics. So the main character of Nyx Wotan, the Monitor, the last living Monitor, who's sort of our initial avatar into this world, the first character we're really introduced to and the last character we say goodbye to, he has this ship, this I cannot remember how to pronounce it, but this the fuel or whatever it is, this spaceship that can travel between universes, but it's made of music, it's made of harmonics, and they actually strike different chords to travel through different universes. Strangely enough, the 1988 Masters of the Universe movie also plays with this idea. If you remember the character of Gwildor, he had the cosmic key. That's kind of the MacGuffin of the whole thing. Skeletor wanted the cosmic key and they tried to save it. But the cosmic key traveled to different dimensions via harmonics. So this is kind of a more of a broader idea in culture, that music can transport us to different levels of perception, different places. So
go ahead.
Not
to throw you off track, but I think those two ideas are really connected. Like, you went right from the Flash into that, the musical idea. And I think there's one moment where the Flash character notice, I think he notices, like, oh, that's weird, this Earth vibrates differently than the other one. And it's like a totally true thing. Music is a physical vibration. It's not like this magical thing, so of course the Flash would be tuned into it, because he or she or they is always tied into that vibration, so I really liked how that related there. It wasn't another new power that Nyx Wotan has and can't conceive of it, he
just harnesses what we already know. And they really make a point to talk about each world or each multiverse or each universe vibrating on a different frequency. As you said, the Flash makes mention of that too. The other way music works its way into the stories, sometimes subtly in different issues, but very intentionally in Pax Americana, which is their sort of tribute to the Watchmen using the actual charlatan characters. So it's kind of a cool meta commentary. But Frank Quietly, who illustrated that particular issue with Grant Morrison, mentioned they intentionally used the structure of music to beat out and tell that story in much the same way that Alan Moore and Gibbons used time and clocks to tell the original Watchmen story. So here in Pax Americana, it was music, but has a lot of similarities to the Watchmen because music and time are very interrelated too. But it's just cool to see them take that angle and use it for that same purpose. So music very much a part of the multiversity structure and flow, even as it kind of comes to an ending and crescendos to its kind of final confrontation, final climax. Music's very much a part of it all. As it goes through. So I love that artistic side of it too. Grant Morrison very into music and just seeing that really play out through the book. So I've really fallen in love. Like I said, came for the story and the scope, but I'm sticking around, and I think the book is really truly on my shelf for all of these wonderful artistic reasons, that there's all this wonderful artistic subtext.
Well, and then talking about the literal art of it, like the drawn art, I mean, you brought up Quietly, and there is such a distinct look to every book, except like, I would say maybe like 3 of those that you told me to read, because those are the ones that are like really connected to the, sort of story that we're following. And so they are illustrated to look alike, but everything in between has this like very distinct style, and it's all very DC Comics, like mainstream style, but it's unique because I'm flipping through on the Comixology, where you can view all the pages at once, and I could immediately spot the Frank Quitely art. Like there it is.
Yep, absolutely. 100%. And then even like the oh shoot, the Nazi one. I always forget the title of it.
Mastermen.
Illustrated by a lot of the same group who does the Injustice comic series. So I immediately I love that series and sort of really took that on. The Shazam or the Captain Marvel family stuff is very kid friendly.
Yeah,
very Shazam-y. So yeah, the stylistic approach to each of these stories absolutely appropriate, I think, for each of the individual issues.
Yeah,
and then for the two bookends as well. Let's talk about alternate realities, though, because the other thing outside of just really a higher appreciation for the art is this deeper examination of alternate realities through the context of the story. So you think about what we do. We live in the third dimension, three-dimensional objects. We can touch them. We can see them. We can interact with them. Comics exist in two dimensions. So we look at them in that context. Think about what a fourth dimensional being, how they would interpret how they would interpret us. Would it be similarly to us looking at a comic and looking at a world through two dimensions? Do fourth dimensional beings look at us that same way? And if so, do we sort of just time, can they look forward and backwards on our time like we can on a comic reality? How real is that? How real is our comics or our two dimensions to us? You really start to embrace this idea that we might be actually looking at real events as you read through this book, especially knowing that others might be looking at our stories much the same way. It's kind of very Never-Ending Story-esque, but has that same idea of what are we looking at? What is a story told in two dimensions? It's a sliver of a potential real reality that we can go backwards and forwards through and look at it that way. So just thinking about that as you read the book, just on a general sense, was really fun. But then the story engineers a lot of moments in where you kind of wonder if this is all real. Some of this dialogue and some of these omnipresent narrator passages are talking directly to you as a reader. So it's almost like the two-dimensional world talking back to you, telling you what to do, or guiding you along in a more intentional way than you otherwise would be. You start to think about all of comics in this context. I don't know if you got that during your quick read today, but that
I think the what is it called? The Ultra Comics that issue, Ultra Comics #1. I mean, specifically is like, has a character sitting at a desk facing the camera basically and saying, you're going to turn the page or whatever. And yeah, there's always a weird experience with that. I remember Tom Robbins wrote a book that's all in second person, and it's very strange.
The whole thing opens though with omnipresent dialogue, talking, and you realize it's talking to you. And then, they right away set up this idea that you're being manipulated through this book or through these stories. The Ultra Comics, which were just about there. That definitely does it. But even like the way the story ends and the way these independent universes, like the rabbit superhero character, for example,
Captain Carrot.
Thank you. Sorry. He sees Black Superman. I'll call him that so we know who we're talking about.
Wow.
Well, he is black. You can't call him African American. He's not from Africa. He's not
President Superman.
President Superman. All right.
Actually, I think there are two Black Supermans.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. All right.
Aren't there?
President Superman. Captain Carrot meets him though, and immediately comments on the fact that he used to read that Superman's comics, or I think the Flash did that. Captain Carrot talked about the Superman archetype and how there's a lot of different ones, and he looked, like the most official one. It was the Flash. Red Racer from Earth 36, who talked about reading about President Superman stories. He actually hands him a copy of Action Comics where his own life was represented in it physically. So it introduces this idea that all these comics could be actual sort of manifestations of these other realities. And then we as the super reader are experiencing all of this in real time too. And you almost kind of think of a fractal of somebody above us in a different dimension reading about me, reading about these things. And just, you kind of almost think about like, well, shoot, in my day-to-day, how much of my day-to-day is in a comic book somewhere in some other reality, you know, or is a story for somebody in a higher level of dimension than what we're living in. Gets very meta very quickly.
Yeah, for sure.
Almost psychedelic in some ways. You kind of start to ponder this as you're reading it. So you're taking in the story, but your mind kind of drifts off thinking about like, ooh, who's reading who, which of these things are real, who's for us to say. A lot of big thinking, Todd.
Yeah. I'm glad you used that word psychedelic, because that was the thing that came up in my reading of it, like over and over. And I think because of that structure where it is, yes, it is one big thematic work, but because it's split into these separate issues that are all essentially one shots in a different world, there's just this jarring like change of pace when you flip from one issue to another, you know?
Yeah.
And so that does give you this just, and you know, the colors change and the style of art changes and everything changes. And so it's, when you're seeing it all in one big volume, it is very like psychedelic, you know, it's like all the lights just change all of a sudden. So,
yep.
And especially because the way I read it, where I was skipping around to those issues you told me to read. So I'm like swiping up and just like, as I'm on the multi-page view in the digital thing, I'm just letting it like run with all these colors. And I was, you know, going, okay.
Yeah.
Crazy looking.
Well, let's talk about the giant elephant in the room, which is the Ultra Comics issue.
Yeah.
And I hinted at this and I kind of briefly mentioned it in our last episode, but honest to God, this is sort of the linchpin of the entire thing, both in terms of the story, but also if you really want to find ground zero of the most, I think, daring sort of avant-garde portion of this whole thing, it's this Ultra Comics issue. And it kind of comes towards the end if you're reading the collected volume. It's kind of towards the end, and there are very good reasons for that. But it is, in the context of the actual story, there's this haunted comics issue called Ultra Comics, and you see people, other characters thumbing through it. You see it pop up in different issues, and there's sort of an uneasiness to it. It's treated as odd or even deliberately dangerous.
They say the word cursed. Like
cursed.
Characters actually say that. Like, we've heard this is cursed.
Yeah, and like, for example, in one of the one shots or one of the issues, The Just, which is about the children of the main Justice League that we know. In the future, they sort of exist in this world where Superman created very effective robot clones of himself, and there is no reason for any of these superheroes to exist anymore, so they're very bored and very maladjusted. But in that series, the Ultra Comics issue pops up. Lex Luthor's daughter, Alexis Luthor, is reading it. It actually causes one of the characters, Megamorpho, to commit suicide. It's and sort of there's only, I think Damian is the only character who seems concerned about this. He goes back to, because Alexis was reading it too, and so he immediately goes, "Oh my God, this!" And you're left to kind of wonder if it didn't cause Alexis to do what she did in that issue, which is take over the Superman robot army, and they sort of leave it on a massive cliffhanger. So in that issue, it really does cause actual damage, actual evil is done through that issue. In another one, the Dr. Fate one, the Dr. Fate story, it's sort of an artifact in Dr. Fate's library, and one of the characters picks it up, and Dr. Fate goes, "No, you can't. It's cursed." And it led to believe that it actually curses one of those characters. So it sort of has this reputation that builds throughout the main narrative of the Multiversity. But then you actually get to read it yourself. It pops up, and I can't even imagine in the original release of these books if people knew that was coming. So imagine, you're going to your comic shop every week, you're reading, you're going through this, you're into the Multiversity, and then you go and all of a sudden this issue appears on the stands, and you're used to it because you see the cover, you've heard other characters talk about it. So now you yourself as a reader get to read it. And it's very, what did you make of it, Todd? Because it's very interesting. It's very much meant to be part of the story, but as its own thing is almost even more interesting, more, I think, revolutionary.
There's a part of me that as I thought of it as like physical issues, the mind fuck that would have occurred if you had just picked that one up.
Right?
And like I said, this was a very difficult book to get into when it was released as separate issues, because you didn't really have a map of where to go. And I know I picked up that one that's like the Society of whatever. It's not super villains, is it? This is
No.
the kind of retro one.
Yeah.
I remember picking that one up with no, not having read Multiversity #1 and not knowing what was going on. So I can't imagine if I had picked up Ultra Comics #1, it would not have made any sense, because on it does not, for me, stand up as a comic on its own. Mm-hmm. But it's just like fascinating that they made a full comic of the thing that is being taught. Like, they made the MacGuffin. I guess it's, I don't know if it's technically a MacGuffin, but that's what they made. And then they made an artifact of it, and you could collect that. And it's like your key to understanding it. It's your skeleton key that opens up the whole game.
It does, but it's also creepy as hell, right? It is one of the creepiest comics I've ever read. And not only because they've been referencing it in a menacing kind of way up until this point, but you just kind of read through it, the way all the characters, when they're looking directly at you, you can't look away. Like just seeing some of these eyes and like they're pointing at you, the interaction through the panel to the audience is very deliberate and very just sort of unsettling. At one point there's a cult of cannibal kids that come into play, and you're like, what the hell is this? And just once in a while, the panel that really sort of unnerved me was early on. The character, it's called Ultra Comics, but there's a character inside it also called that. It becomes clear as to why. We'd almost have to recite the entire issue to explain most of it. But there's a panel kind of early on after they create Ultra Comics, a character where he's helping a woman and her son in the alley. And then the next panel, he's helping some people consumed by some alien virus. And then he's mourning the loss of his counterpart or his younger cousin, almost like the death of Supergirl. And then there's a panel where he is holding what you assume to be a villain against a bloody brick wall, and his entire center has been ripped out, and Ultra Comics is holding his throat, and he's looking at you directly through the panel going, what are you looking at? And it's really unsettling. And it just kind of and just as soon as you turn the page, it's like, you just kind of forget about that. They just gloss over that ever happened, and they move on. Just stuff like that was creepy. The people who made him breaking the fourth wall and just talking to you randomly, these sort of regular business guys in kind of 1950s black and white, or very desaturated panels, just kind of looking at you, very matter of factly talking.
Not a hoax, not a dream.
Yeah, and then panels where there's the scene is going on while another narrative, sort of a super narrative box, starts yelling at you to stop turning the page, and it creates this dissonance that's very unsettling. Eventually we find out that, and again, spoilers, but obviously we've been spoiling it the whole time. Eventually we find out that Ultra Comics, the character, becomes this uber villain called the Empty Hand, or referred to as the Empty Hand. And you find out that that's who the Gentry made him. At the very end of the issue, they eventually get him, they start to corrupt him, and then he becomes the Empty Hand. They don't deliberately say that. You sort of have to piece that together yourself. It's pretty obvious, but that's what happens to him. So then that creates a lot of questions, like, why did the Gentry have to do that? Like, what did they need? What the hell is, who created Ultra Comics? Like, who are these other people? They say it's Earth Prime. Is that our Earth? Or are we meant to think that this was, created by just so many things, Todd, so many questions.
Yeah. And no, I think because there's another, maybe it's in that issue, or there's some other place in there where they distinguish Earth Prime. I think it's the businessman that's at the desk, like speaking to you about the creation of it. And he's saying, we're on Earth Prime where there are no superheroes. And it's basically describing us, like the Earth we're on. And we created this. And so because we've created this fantasy, again, I'm like only now tying it into the themes you've brought up. It is that chaos magic ritual, which has created this actual being in another universe.
Yes. And so when you think that it's creepy enough just based on those things, but when you realize that Grant Morrison is invoking chaos magic a lot through this whole thing, this whole issue takes on a completely different meaning, where he has set out the intentionality of all this, kind of this mind virus kind of happening. So then you're reading it both sort of from a kind of an amused fan standard comics point of view, but then you're also reading it from a very paranoid, familiar with Grant Morrison and his antics point of view. And it gave me an unsettling feeling like I was reading The Invisibles again. That book, I'm not going to talk about The Invisibles on here for a while, if ever, because it did unsettle me quite a bit. And I think this issue, while not so severe, evoked a lot of that same just chilled, kind of creeped out feeling that I got while reading The Invisibles. So if that was his intention, if that was the effect he was going for, well done. It also really ties together when other characters and other issues refer to this book as dangerous or cursed, it does sort of feel like that. You're like, wow, I know Grant Morrison wrote this. I know this is, part of an editorial calendar and they put it out per plan, but there's a part in the back of your mind, or a small part of you just kind of goes, what if this just manifested somehow? And
it is, well, and granted, I haven't read all the issues in the entire collection, but of those I read, it is the most that keeps inverting its own reality, back on itself. I think it's in that issue where someone shows Ultra the comic that you are reading. And it's like, no, I know you from this. And you're like, wait, what? If you, the reader, has interpreted this as just another artifact that's on Earth Prime, and you're reading about this thing that all these other Earths are reading about, all of a sudden now that's not true, because now there's a character in the issue that's deconstructing the whole premise of the issue. And you're like, what just happened?
Yeah. It is a mind fuck for this whole thing is very much like that. And some would argue, because I've had this conversation with somebody else who's given it as much thought as I have, some would argue that might be hokey, I guess, or it might be too grand for its own good. But I think Grant Morrison, if you know more about him, he wasn't trying to create some gigantic Stephen King-like opus. I think he was really indulging a lot of what he was naturally into, and used this whole thing as a giant opportunity to really just go crazy on all of that stuff. So it's like, hey, I always wanted to write just a really good pulpy Dr. Fate book. So here's that. But I also wanted to indulge my chaos magic sensibilities and create this weird meta narrative that might manifest in this way. So here's that. I always wanted to do the Charlton Comics' Watchmen character. It really is. If you love Grant Morrison, this is really the purest distillation of him I think you could get in a mainstream context. I think the purest Grant Morrison just in general is something like The Invisibles, but for somebody who's interested in the big two sensibility, this is that for those audience members.
Yeah, I would never recommend this to anyone that's not read comics before.
Oh God, no. Yeah, can you imagine
read Morrison's Batman and Robin?
Yeah,
first,
yeah.
Then get to this. It's crazy. That's really interesting to hear that other feedback about this being kind of hokey, because I don't think at any point did while I had my own issues with, I wouldn't even call them issues. I don't love this book as much as you do, but I don't think there's any point where I was reading it where I thought that's hokey,
Yeah.
And it definitely is. And I also didn't think of it as, like you mentioned, it's not like he's trying to write this. You said Stephen King. I would also associate a George R. R. Martin. It's not like some epic tale of fantasy or something. It really does feel like Grant Morrison was given the sandbox of DC characters and the freedom to create his own, and he just went nuts.
Yeah. And just indulged everything. So we can get more into any of this stuff. I feel like I could talk 8 hours about just all the art based reasons I love this. I've mentioned in a previous episode, probably multiple previous episodes, for me, the truest distillation of what art is somebody's point of view. Okay. And you think about the most interesting works of art, it is truly somebody's unique point of view on something. And that could be abstract, it could be literal, but you're still getting that distillation of that person's uncompromised point of view. I feel like this whole collection, this series, this graphic novel is truly that for Grant Morrison. Yeah, there were editors, and yeah, DC probably gave him some guidelines, but he really made the most of that condition. So just kind of some additional favorite aspects that
can I tag on to something there?
Of course. Yeah.
I think what's really interesting about that, because I don't know that I've read any Morrison that does not happen in the DC universe. But I am inclined to think that his genius really explodes when he is allowed to do something like this and go nuts within an existing universe, like of characters.
I mean, we think about his original, what brought him to the table or what brought him to the show was Arkham Asylum. That was, you thought you knew Batman. Holy crap. That just that blew the doors wide open on what a Batman book could be. And that followed The Dark Knight Returns, right? So that we'd already seen this crazy, like, wow, this is Batman. And then he's like, oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. And then he gave us a really interesting view of what comics could be, what Batman could be, what a superhero, like a mainstream. I mean, just that was the origin point. But this is, and there's a lot of Grant Morrison sort of like any good art, think about the most controversial bands or indie bands, or think about just anything in art that's got haters as well as people who love it. And then most people are sort of in the middle, kind of bouncing back and forth between I hate it and I love it. That to me is the best kind of stuff, because we can be talking about this for years and years and years and still not agree.
Yeah, it's I only tack that on because I think it's so much more interesting to me. It's so weird because on this show we talk about a lot of creator-owned titles, and I don't know that I would be as interested in Grant Morrison original work. I don't know. I can't even see if that's true or not. I just see it as like, what a crazy thing that he was allowed to do this.
You should read The Invisibles, at least that first one, to get a sense of what he's like when it's all him.
Gotcha. Yeah. Good call.
When it's not based on existing characters, because there's a lot of this, but he takes it even further. And it's just, like I said, you get a sense of this guy's when he really wants to take you on a journey and really indulge himself where he goes. And it's not necessarily a place I want to go, but it's interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Well, and it's also that, he knows so much about the DC universe. Like this is like such an ultimate like comics fan, but so then when they just let him off the leash, it's nuts. It's not like anything else you've read where they're simply referencing, or there's like passing references or like shout outs to old plots. It's like the way he uses the history of the entire universe to inform his crazy universe is nuts. And I've read All-Star Superman by him and then Batman and Robin, and I would recommend both of those. Like they're both just such, nutty new takes on those characters. And anyway, sorry to divert. What were some of your other favorite aspects of this?
Oh, no worries. No, I like that extra info on Morrison. I should have mentioned this probably in the alternate universe discussion, but he does this thing, and I noticed the first time around, but I have even more love for it now, especially given the end of the current end of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and just farewell to those characters. He does this thing where he parodies the Marvel characters or Marvel comics through the use of this publisher called Major Comics. And several times he introduces counterparts to the traditional Marvel characters in much the same way that Watchmen did that to the Charlton characters, which he kind of keeps coming back to that. He had a lot of fun. And I don't know if this is the first time these parodies or these counterparts have ever appeared in the DC continuity. That would be a great question to get some clarity on, because if not, I love it even more. If they have appeared before and he's just giving us more time with them, great. But like, for example, there instead of Doctor Doom, there is Lord Havoc, who when you see him looks a lot like Doctor Doom, but it's its own thing. It's like they stretch the trademark infringement just enough. You see like a very clearly Iron Man kind of character, but I forget what his name is.
Yeah,
you see. You see what is essentially a Captain Marvel character, but she's slightly different, and a Hawkeye character is slightly different. So you see these Marvel counterparts that are very specific. Right away, too, you're introduced to what is essentially a Thor counterpart in this character called the Thunderer. He strangely, I don't know what race or ethnicity he's supposed to be. It seems like he's darker skinned, but then he kind of speaks in sort of the same old English Shakespearean that you hear in the first Thor movie. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's really interesting to follow him because he's kind of like one part Aquaman, but he's still.
It's weird for sure. He's one of those that I thought was being introduced just to kill him off, and then he ends up having this like larger role, and it was like, oh, this is crazy. It was And
instead of like the Fantastic Four, it's the Future family. So it's Frank Future, but it's clearly a guy who stretches a lot, and he's got a rock friend and a fire guy. It's just like the whole thing. It's clearly homaging. I wonder if they had the rights, if they would have just actually said the Marvel universe and those characters. But at the same time, I'm kind of glad they didn't, because I love this creative workaround. It's just so much fun to see what these characters look like through his eyes if he had to, if he wanted to represent them.
It's way more fun. And you bring up the Captain Carrot, which is hilarious because I remember in the, either my brother or I had purchased an issue of Captain Carrot back in like the 80s.
Oh, so he's a real character from
that DC was a real, but not in continuity. It was like one of those that they probably acquired it from Charlton or something and just kept publishing it on the side. And, I don't know that he ever made an appearance in, the Infinite Earths, but it's a real thing. Like that was his thing, was like super zany, like kind of Roger Rabbit.
Yeah.
Where he gets flattened, like totally two-dimensionally flattened by a villain and then just springs back into shape,
up. But he's the only one who can do that, right? Like, it's not like
because
the other characters can.
It's like almost part of his superpower. And
he gets his head lopped off at some point, and he's just like, "Oh, my body's over there, and I'm over here." And
I was gonna say, like way more gory than the Captain Carrot ever got. They just like Grant Morrison obviously was like, this would be fun. Let's behead him. And the body's still fighting the battle, trying to eat a carrot, but the head is like far away. But he also, there's like self-parody in the DC universe where he makes fun of Little Gotham, Dustin Nguyen's art, where he sort of represented the whole Bat family as like, they weren't children. They were still like their normal ages, but they were just drawn to look sort of shorter and squat and sort of like children.
Yeah.
It was a book for children. But those just appear like they're just normal, like little people who
actually play a
and then
role.
and then have this pretty crazy like plot thing happen with them.
They matter a lot to the main story in a lot of ways.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's like all the universe is folding in on themselves. It is totally a thing that like we mentioned in our Crisis on Infinite Earths episode, it's very hard to revisit that book and put yourself in the headspace of whatever that was, 85 or whatever. And see it as like, wow, this was such a huge idea, but to read it with modern sensibilities and, we pointed out a lot of the culturally, insensitive parts of it, but it's just also like, it just reads kind of hacky because it's an idea and nothing more. Mm-hmm. But to me, reading Multiversity, this book couldn't have existed without that book.
Exactly.
And so this is in many ways like the crisis book that, my generation needed to kind of like feel like, oh, now it's being handled with the proper amount of insanity.
I'm not the multiversity event or multiversal event you wanted. I'm the one. It really is. This whole thing should just be titled Grant Morrison. I had my cake and I ate it too. Because he got to indulge all his stuff and he got to retcon so much and basically make everything, all Elseworlds books, everything part of continuity.
Yeah.
He and you can read, I'm just looking at Wikipedia as we sit here and chat. He had a hand in guiding the creation of the New 52.
Yeah.
and sort of had set forth some things that would be happening, wouldn't be happening. So this is a natural extension of Final Crisis, of Countdown, of you're going all the way back to, again, The Kingdom with Mark Waid, where they invented hypertime, allowing a lot of these things to be possible. So it really is, it's one of these interesting experiments where he got to have all of this creative freedom with all of these what if stories and still have it live in the true canon of the primary universe, because all of these extended universes either are connected through the orrery of worlds, or they're reading about each other through comics. So anything he wanted to make, any Elseworlds idea, the Nazi Superman, like all of that stuff, it's like, yeah, well, I'm going to do an issue and it's going to count. I mean, what an amazing opportunity to do all that and indulge your inner chaos magician and like just all of these things he got to do. And I love that. And the more I sort of ponder that and think through the opportunity he got and what he did with it, I love it even more.
That's so interesting to hear you say. And I know I keep interpreting this through the prism of the original Crisis, but I do think that I don't know. I guess what you have to do when you walk into either one of those books is like the original Crisis was written to solve a problem, which is so weird, but it was this problem of continuity where they had three different Supermans, and they had a Justice Society and a Justice League, but they weren't even in the same time period or on the same Earth or blah, blah, blah. It was really confusing.
Yeah.
This is like, it's confusing, but it's allowed to be confusing because that multiverse is explained. It's not a meta problem for the writers. It's like a playground for the writer. Every world can be totally different. Like on this one, you can have these, like all these superheroes have different proportions and they look like children on this other world. But and on whatever it is, it can be that way. But it still can't be read. I think this is what I'm getting to is you still can't pick this up as like, let me read an interesting superhero book. I feel like you almost need to come in with a lot of that baggage from DC, specifically, and not that you need to know things in order to understand this, but just to kind of know those things. Like, it used to be that they would just sort of spin off every group into its own world in order to keep writing about it in a specific era, and here it's, everything we've talked about, you sort of have to come into this book with that. And that makes it difficult to recommend to anyone as any kind of like pure read, I guess. Like, this is such a cool work of art to say, yes, if you love comic books, dig into this one, I think you get there though. I think you do the work to understand the medium a little bit better. Part of this is self-serving because this was my journey to this book, but you do the work to get to this through this medium, to understand it, to have a higher level of appreciation for it. You understand some of the event books either through reading them or through just Googling, doing the broad research. You understand the artist and the mind of the creator in Grant Morrison, and even just his collaborators. He has I can't stress enough. It's ludicrous.
He has like literally the greatest hits of comics artists, illustrators, colorists, pencilers. The fact alone that he got Frank Quitely is amazing, but it just goes on and on and on and on and on. So it's the mind of Grant Morrison as seen through some of the best in the business currently. Well, so you have this just amazing confluence of amazing direction and amazing craft in one thing. It's like even just a general comics fan should appreciate it on that level.
Did you, in the physical artifact that you have, did you get that one issue that's called the guidebook?
Yeah. So
you have the list of like all the artists, and the way they do it is by Earth.
Yep. And this is my probably my other absolute favorite part of this is that square in the middle, much like the Ultra Comics issue, there is another issue, which is this guidebook to the multiverse, which appears in the story as a physical thing, but then you obviously get to read it too. And he makes good on the New 52. He justifies it being a thing. He details all 52 Earths. Now, granted, some of them are mystery or unknown worlds, which was kind of clever. He gives himself some room later on. Some things he actually invents for the first time, which I don't know if DC Canon has taken advantage of, but he sort of puts it out there like, hey, this Earth exists. Here are the characters. Here's its deal. If anybody wants to take this and run with it, I think that was the intention behind some of these things. Earth, for example, I'm just sort of thumbing through this at random. Earth 37 is a world of lawless heroes and cynical champions. It's kind of a steampunk sort of Earth, and maybe Superman isn't what you think he is, but Robin is different. I mean, there's another one where it's literally a sort of blaxploitation Superman, and just some very crazy, highly influenced by the 70s aesthetic kind of drawing characters. It just goes on and on and on and on. And these are all very interesting. I would read titles in all of these, and I am kind of the last guy to be a big two mainstream fan, but I would love all these. So he basically says, hey, yeah, the New 52 was worth it. Here's all the ways we can take it. And this whole idea of collapsing universes or expanding them, let's just do everything, have all of it exist, and have all of it strangely be in canon. I would imagine if he ever comes back to this, it'd be cool to see him include like the White Knight universe as another Earth. That's maybe one of these mystery Earths. He could kind of backfill in some of this stuff and make all of this exist in the same multiversal continuity, but on their own terms can still be Elseworlds books, can still be one-shots or one-offs. It's just so cool to think about all of this being valid, right? Just all of this. We have talked on the show many times about loving the Elseworlds stuff. I forget what is Marvel's version of that called.
What If?
What Ifs. The What Ifs and the Elseworlds stuff being almost more interesting than the mainstream continuity. Well, here Grant Morrison says yes, and it can all be coexisting. It can all be valid. You don't have to pick one or the other. It's all part of it. I love that. I love that so much.
Yeah, it's I'm glad you went back to this. This is as you mentioned at the top, this is a great book to revisit. It is so like huge. I mean, what you mentioned, it's something like 7 or 8 issues, but the Comixology file is 450 pages.
Yeah.
So like a normal 8-issue run would be like, what is it, like 150 or something when you, well, I guess that's, it would be more than that, but like 5 issues is usually around like 150 pages or something.
Yeah.
So this is enormous, and definitely not a one sitting book, not a casual read, nothing like that. So I would still stick with where we started at the top, which is, I think if you're really interested in exploring this, you probably need the print version, and then go back to the digital version to feel that guided view. It is available to borrow on Comixology right now. So if you're an unlimited member, check it out.
Please. I mean, and that is actually where I started with this.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, I had grabbed 2 or 3. It's funny you said that the individual issues on Comixology are useless, because you're right. But that's actually where I started, because when it was still coming out as I kind of got into it. So I hadn't collected it, but you absolutely should treat this as one full piece.
I almost think we should tell people the issues you told me to read in order to get the overview, because I think that's really helpful. And why hide the secret map to this? Like, what do you recommend?
I recommend that you start from the beginning and just read straight through, honestly. But if you want to kind of pick and choose at it, I definitely think you should do the Multiversity issue 1 and the Multiversity issue 2, which bookend this whole thing. I think you should do, honestly, do Pax Americana, because I did not read that one, and I wish I had. As its own standalone, like if that had just come out unconnected to this as just a cool little standalone one-shot, it would still be badass. It's a really freaking well done piece. If you want to kind of get a sense of the overarching storyline, though, Multiversity 1 and 2, I would do the Just, and I would do Ultra Comics. Yeah. Those 4 kind of provide you a nice taste of what it is, but then you might as well just finish it up and get the other 3 too.
Right.
Because it's at that point, then you're missing Masterman, which is an amazing take on what if Kal-El had landed in Nazi Germany instead of America. Like I mentioned, Pax Americana, the Society of Superheroes, which is the Dr. Fate kind of pulp throwback. really freaking good. Just stylistically really interesting. The Marvel Shazam one is really, really good. Am I missing any? Oh, the guide to the multiverse is both a guide, but also has some story components in it too. Gives you a bigger sense of what's going on at the top level.
Well, what I really like about your map to it of doing Multiversity 1 and 2.
Yeah.
But what I would recommend is do number 1, then do the Just, then do Ultra Comics, then do Multiversity number 2. And so that's basically the order in which they appear in the book. But go in that order because number 1 will introduce the central, idea and problems, and then the Just does a really cool look at how the heroes of one world are viewing the events of another world through the comic books.
Mm-hmm.
And so you start to pick up on that why Ultra Comics matters. Then you read Ultra Comics and you're like, oh, this is crazy. And then Multiversity number 2 will tie it all together. I am going to go back and read those issues that I have not read because like I mentioned, the Society of Superheroes was one that I picked up as a one shot and didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
I'm so interested in Pax Americana and Mastermen and the Marvel World one, which I can't, the Captain Marvel heroes, the Shazam heroes.
Yeah.
But yeah, that probably does it all. That's probably all the ones I want. That's all of them, right?
Well, I'll confess. So I own this. When we talk about the comics worth having on your shelf, holy crap! This is probably this occupies a rare space in my library in that I own it digitally as a few scattershot single issues. I own it digitally as the collected deluxe edition. I own it physically as the hardcover deluxe edition, which absolutely I recommend getting. And just because I loved having the meta artifact of these individual issues, I own the 7 one-shots, including the Ultra Comics, as individual issues too. I ended up going back and grabbing those. I do not own Multiversity 1 and 2's single issues because those are sort of that I didn't feel as necessary because they don't kind of exist in the physical world in the same way that these other issues do inside. I can't even talk about this without it being just convoluted.
Anyway, it's totally convoluted.
I mean, because I was gonna just get the Ultra Comics single issue just to have, because I think as a collector, knowing what that represents, it's kind of fun to own it too. And then I just ended up going, well, hell, I'll just get the other 6. So I'll just have the 7 main issues. So I am kind of a completist when it comes to this series. I'm in the process of doing the same thing for Watchmen, by the way. So.
Well, that's really cool to know. And, it's that same idea we harp on all the time on the show, which is if it's, you look at this as art that's worth having on your shelf, then, you want it on your shelf, in whatever format you can. And it is. So I had forgotten that you have the individual issues, but I'm pretty sure you've told me that before, possibly on our last episode about this. And
no, it wasn't. That was not the case then. This is since.
Gotcha. Oh, cool. Yeah, no, I'm glad you did that. That's a neat thing to do. You've taken it to the Griffin and Sabine level of
yes, I have.
Now I can pretend I am receiving this message through this comic.
Well, pretend or just sort of convince yourself of it, because given how very meta, how very layered and psychedelic and fractal this thing is, I think it's necessary that I own these physically. It really does truly make me an actor in the story, right? You're sort of fulfilling what it is. I think if you're really a fan of this, you kind of have to. So here I am. Even think about, they kind of treat Ultra Comics like the videotape in the movie The Ring, where it just sort of works its magic and I almost kind of feel like I am Naomi Watts at the end by making copies and sending them off. I'm purchasing the actual Ultra Comics single issue myself. So now it's, if you believe the idea virus part of it, it has worked its magic on me.
Very cool.
Anyway.
Yeah. So where can people go if they want to listen to episode number 57 of this podcast?
Yeah, go back into our archive. You can do that by subscribing to Panelism wherever you find podcasts. Just search for that, Panelism. You can also find old archival episodes at panelism.inc. www.panelism.ink, which is coincidentally also our Instagram handle, panelism.inc, where we talk about all this stuff and showcase really cool books and art and other stuff. And it's kind of our primary way of putting stuff out there. So check out all those things. If you're a completist, grab them all. And tell your friends, subscribe and share, and leave comments if you liked it or hated it. We always value listener feedback.
Yeah, on this episode, I mean, yeah, we always do. This, like you said, this is a good book club book. So I would really be interested in other people's opinions on it.
100%. I'm probably going to recommend it to my local comic shop, which I know is always looking for great new picks. So this would be a really good one to bring up.
To the book club, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, until next time, I will see you then, or I will see you at another time.